Hi everyone, I wanted to show you a few watercolour techniques. In April you should be receiving your starter kit, which has loads of different materials in there, different tools like pencils, paintbrushes, including a watercolour set. And you may have got some watercolour paper, but if not, that will be in your next craft kit. But yeah, I wanted to show you a few techniques that you may like to start off and practice and use for watercolour. So you will have got a long red tin of watercolours. This is my tin. They're just a bit different, but it's pretty much the same. You've just got a red tin and a paintbrush in there as well. So how you use watercolour is you need water, using watercolour obviously because it's in the name, but a lot of people will try and make the paint quite thick with watercolour, but the idea with watercolour is you're supposed to add loads of water to your pigment, and you layer up. So you work in layers with watercolour. So generally you do a base layer, you let that dry, you then add on another layer, you would let that dry, and then you'd add on, you just keep building up layers, and that's how you get your darker layers, your darker areas of your painting and your lighter areas of your painting, is actually by layering rather than making the pigment darker or lighter. So it's a different paint, it's a different way of using paint. I really like watercolour. I think it's really like relaxing and flowing, and you can do a lot more with it than you might be able to do with other paints. But I'll show you a few techniques first of all. So we're gonna mix our paint first of all, I think. So as you can see, I've already got paint on there, but with watercolour, it will just automatically lift off again, so you can reuse, you can keep reusing the paint, which is what I tend to do. Now, this is quite light, so I think I'm going to add some more. I'd like to make a purple, so I'm going to add some blue. So purple is a secondary colour, so you have to mix your two primary colours of red and blue together to make a purple. There we go. So that's probably still fairly light. So I add a bit more pigment. Great. So there is my purple. Now if I went straight directly onto the page, you can see it's quite, the edges are quite like clean, so you can see the edge of where my paintbrush has gone. And if you add the paint directly onto the paper, you have to drag it around quite a lot. Now if I added a little bit more water to that, as you can see, it's actually kind of blending in the outline a little bit. So by adding a bit more water to it, I can drag it around the page a little bit more. So can you see this is quite free flowing, and watercolour, it can be tricky because sometimes you can't control where your pigment or paint goes, but I quite enjoy that. There we go. So you see this is the bit where I've added water to it, and this is just the paint directly onto paper, so you can tell a difference. This looks a little bit more free flowing than that one. Now if I put water, just plain water, onto the paper, this is another technique you can use. So I've just watered it, water onto the paper. I get my pigment, I'm gonna add a bit more paint. Now if I take a bit here and I drop it into the water, you see what it's doing? Just kind of spreads. And as you can tell, it's given, again, a different look to how I would have done it here. So this is water already onto the paper, add your pigment, and it just kind of floats around in it. And as you can see, it gives quite a soft edge, this technique, which I quite enjoy. I really like a soft edge in watercolour. Yeah. Now, wet on wet technique is when I would add another colour to this that's wet. So the page is wet, and then I'm going to add another colour. Let's add a red, shall we? Let's add some more red to this. You see I've made a different colour now. more orange, isn't it? Probably a bit too strong, so add some more water to make it a bit more translucent. So translucent is more see-through, and opaque is when you can see less through the paint. This is kind of in the middle. So the paper's still wet, this is still wet, and now I'm going to add wet paint to the wet. As you can see, just kind of spreading around the paint a little bit more. I quite enjoy that. Add a little bit more water to make it spread a bit more. Now if I quickly add in some other pigment, it's quite fun. It's quite fun to just play around with, really. Just drop in your pigment, see what happens. With watercolour, to start off with, it's probably best to experiment with it a little bit. Now let's see that. That's still fairly wet. I've kind of smudged it a little bit there. But I'll wait for this to dry a little bit more and then show you a wet on dry. So this is dry now, so I'm going to add some of this wet pigment into this little dry area. Now, can you see here, it hasn't actually blended into the other colour, because it's not like this one, where this one has blended. As you can see, the colours, the orange and the blues, have kind of blended and mixed in, and there's not a clear line between the two colours, which I really enjoy. However, this one, because you've started with it dry, the base is dry, you've added wet paint to it, you actually get a very defined layer. Now this is how you layer up your colours within watercolour, and you can make it look 3D. So I've added on this different tone. Again, if I wanted to smudge that edge is quite sharp. If I wanted to smudge it, I just add some water to it, drag it around with the paintbrush a bit, and it gets rid of the edge. And as you can see, this is a really nice build-up of colour. And then if I waited for this orange one to dry, which I'll show you in a second probably, and added another colour on top, it would look even darker. And that's how when you shade objects, or when you're painting in objects, say you've got a flower and the inside of the flower is a lighter pink to the outside of the flower petal, for example, that's how you'd layer it up. So you'd keep adding more and more layers to the inside of the petal on your drawing to make it darker. I'm going to show you a blended sky technique now. And then we'll move on to a fun bird activity.